on my computer. There you go. Okay, I think everyone is in the room. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brandon Murphy, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's session. On behalf of the Copper Foundation and our partners, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Cari-Bois Natural Capital Hub's webinar series, A Guide to Natural Capital. This series is a collaboration between the Cari-Bois Natural Capital Hub and the Cari-Bois News Network. The Hub is a regional platform championed by the Copper Foundation and the Merchant Bank that brings together knowledge, tools, networks to mainstream natural capital approaches across the Caribbean. The Hub partners with private sectors to ensure that nature's value is recognized in decision-making and to equip businesses to lead the way in driving nature-positive actions. The Cari-Bois News Network is another initiative of the Copper Foundation, and it's a vibrant community of journalists and storytellers dedicated to making environmental issues visible, accessible, and impactful across the region. Their work ensures that conversations like today's don't just stay in virtual rooms, but ripple outwards, informing, inspiring, and driving meaningful change. This webinar series is designed to inspire and empower Caribbean private sector by creating a space for learning, exchange, and collaboration. Each edition would explore practical ways in which businesses can integrate biodiversity and natural capital into their operations, reporting, and long-term strategies. Today's session, linking between biodiversity and business, will focus on how global frameworks, such as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, translate into national action plans and what this means for the private sector. We'll also explore why biodiversity is not just an environmental issue, but a corporate one, affecting risk, resilience, and competitiveness, and highlighting emerging regional examples where businesses are already taking steps forward. But before we get started, a quick reminder is to please keep your microphones muted during the presentations. Feel free to share your burning questions in the chat at any time, and be mindful and respectful of your comments and discussions in the chat. With that, let's move on to today's agenda. So we'll begin with Ms. Deanna Albert from Advisors Next Door, who will set the stage by exploring how the KMGBF connects with national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and what this means for the Caribbean context. Next, you will hear from Dr. Samuel Sinclair of Biodiversify, who will drive into the question, why is biodiversity a corporate issue? He will walk us through the risks and opportunities that biodiversity presents to business continuity, supply chain, and competitiveness. Following that, Ms. Keisha Garcia from Answer Merchant Bank Limited will bring us closer home with regional case studies, highlighting how some of us in the private sector are already leveraging biodiversity insights for corporate decision-making, and what lessons can we learn from these examples. Finally, we'll open the floor for a segment dedicated to discussion and reflections, and this will be your chance to share your insights, ask questions, and engage directly with our speakers. So you can feel free to unmute your mic for this section. So now let's move on to our first presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Deanna Albert, a distinguished sustainability professional whose work has shaped biodiversity policy and practices across the Caribbean. Deanna holds a BSc in Environmental and Natural Resource and Biology and an MSc in Biodiversity Conservation and Sustainable Development from the University of the West Indies. She has co-led the preparation of the Bailey's 2025 to 2035 NBSAP and is currently leading a similar effort for Trinidad and Tobago in collaboration with the Proper Foundation. Early in her career, while at Canary, Deanna established the Caribbean Small Grants Mechanism under the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, empowering civil society organizations to advance biodiversity and climate resilience. Today, as the principal consultant at Advisors Next Door, she leads assignments for governments, multilateral agencies, and NGOs with her work spanning over a dozen Caribbean countries and collaborations with institutions such as the CARICOM, the United Nations Environment Programme, FAO, and the World Bank. So Deanna, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Perfect time for me to get a cough, right? So I'm just gonna share my replace current share. I'm gonna share my slides and we can get started. Great. Thank you very much, Brandon. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining and hearing me talk for about 15 minutes. So my presentation is going to be focused on linking the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework through NBSAP, so National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, and explain to businesses and private sector how this really relates to your organization's strategy, resilience, and reputations. So first, just a little quick introduction into biodiversity loss. It poses direct risks to business operations and long-term resilience. So biodiversity is biological diversity. It's the variety of life on Earth. Now, that includes our genetic diversity, for example, a variety within species. That can include crop varieties that help agriculture adapt to climate change. Species diversity, which also includes countless plants, animals, fungi, all the things that form part of our natural world. And finally, ecosystem diversity, which is the variety of habitats. So from our coral reefs to our forests and our mangroves, they are all the areas that provide the resources that we depend on, including businesses. These layers of biodiversity work together to provide ecosystem services, such as clean food, water, raw materials, climate regulation, and pollination. So therefore, biodiversity is really where we get our resources for our businesses and economies and how we rely on it. So it's the foundation of many business models, and whether in agriculture, tourism, pharmaceuticals, or energy, you do rely on biodiversity for your profits. So investing in biodiversity action is therefore a long-term business resilience plan. Now, that being said, I want to introduce you all to the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the global agreement under which we will eventually have national agreements that frame how we relate to biodiversity conservation. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a mouthful, it's called the KMGBF, or the GBF for short, is a global agreement under the UN Convention for Biological Diversity, or the CBD. Now, I've broken this down into three parts because the Convention on Biological Diversity is the main treaty or agreement that everyone has signed on, or at least 196 countries. And this UN treaty is really all about biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of natural resources. Now, I like to think about this as the biodiversity vision of the Paris Agreement for addressing climate change. And during the conference of parties, or the big meeting, the 15th one, all of these countries decided to develop the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF, in 2022. Now, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework basically aims to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And this framework is really under 4 global goals, which have 23 targets under them. And interestingly, this is the first time that businesses are explicitly recognized as part and parcel of biodiversity conservation on a global scale. So now that we've introduced the global situation, you would really want to know what is the real action that translates for us on a national level. Well, that's where National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, NBSAP or NBSAPs, really translate this. They take the global targets into national action plans, which directly shape the policies, the investments, and the business expectations, which are really key for us in the private sector. Now, I've put 3 examples here. Might go through maybe 1 or 2 on each. So for Trinidad, for example, we are presently revising Trinidad's NBSAP. And the way that private sector is really being integrated is that we're doing multi-sector consultations where the private sector is a key stakeholder. Another key issue, another key way that the NBSAP is integrating the private sector is that it is providing biodiversity data or filling gaps where the government or other agencies do not yet have information. Similarly, for Belize, the NBSAP provision, which completed in April, and now there's a final 2025 to 2035 NBSAP for that country, included revisions that incorporated their 3 main sectors. So that would be tourism, fisheries, and agriculture. And it didn't just consider the biodiversity aspects, it also considered the actual development aspects and the national development goals, and made sure that the global biodiversity targets align with these national development goals. Finally, we have the EU, where member states are now incorporating the global biodiversity targets into their actual national reporting. And this is just to show that even in bigger regions, these things are becoming more normalized. So biodiversity metrics are actually being linked to corporate sustainability reporting and investor disclosures. So that really means that the global biodiversity framework is really being integrated on a national level in all countries, right? It's a legal requirement. As long as we're part of the CBD, we've signed on to this, and therefore that is why all of these countries are now updating their NBSAPs to also include and embed and update to align to all 23 targets. So this slide really just gives you an idea of the full global biodiversity framework. On the left-hand side, you'll see the 4 key goals: reducing threats, meeting people's needs, tools and solutions, and implementation support. And under these 4 goals, we have 23 targets. Now, the GBF recognizes the private sector as essential to reporting, reducing impacts, and financing biodiversity action. And these things actually tie to 3 key targets of the 23, which we're going to go through. So the first one I want to bring your attention to is mainstreaming of biodiversity values. So target 14 is about mainstreaming biodiversity, meaning governments and businesses and the private sector must integrate biodiversity into your policies, your practices, and your value chains. So it's similar to how climate change is currently being considered and embedded into standards for many companies. The other target is target 15, the business's role. So this introduces a major shift. As I mentioned, this is the first time that biodiversity conservation and biodiversity agreements on a national and international level have explicitly recognized that businesses also need to consider biodiversity. Target 15 is where this is done. There's large businesses and their financial institutions are going to be expected to assess and disclose their impacts, their dependencies, and their risks related to biodiversity. This isn't only just voluntary, it sets the stage for future reporting requirements, again, much like we've seen with the climate-related disclosures that are presently ongoing. Finally, we have target 19, which focuses on mobilizing resources, aka getting money. So governments alone cannot meet biodiversity goals. Private finance through investments, through partnerships, and through innovation mechanisms are critical to bridge that gap and get that funding that we have gaps in right now. So these three targets, 14, 15, and 19, when implemented on a national level through your NBSAPs, your National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, they will directly influence the national policies and create new opportunities and responsibilities for businesses. So I know people hear opportunities and they get excited. They hear responsibilities and they start to look a little suspicious, right? But the good news is that businesses don't need to start over. The KMGBF, or the Global Biodiversity Targets, especially the ones that align with y'all, which will be 14, 15, and 19, these are already integrated, already familiar with reporting systems that y'all may be using in your businesses, right? So this slide, I wanted to do a short table, a summary table, so that if nothing else, you're able to kind of see where your businesses can presently fit in to the targets that will eventually make it into the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans in your respective regions. So target 14 has already corporate reporting tools that align to it, specifically the Natural Capital Protocol and GRI standards, as well as CDP. Target 15 also has some of the same, and target 19. Now, what I really wanted to do here was to also align this to the UN SDGs. And that's because a lot of corporate reporting tools also align to SDGs. And it's an easy way for businesses to see exactly where they may already be aligning to the global biodiversity framework targets. A lot of times when we're learning about something new, a good starting point is something that we're more familiar with. And so if you can see and identify any of the SDGs here that you know your business is already contributing to, then part and parcel, you are on your way to contributing to targets 14, 15, or 19, respectively. So investors, regulators, businesses are increasingly expected to disclose their biodiversity impacts and dependencies, similar again to what we've had to do for climate change. And right now, there is a lot of things that may in the future become mandatory. So the timeline right now is that in the past, a lot of things were voluntary. There were early adopters to voluntary disclosures. Some key examples on a global level will be Unilever, as well as Nestle. Nestle would have been disclosing voluntarily their agricultural impacts, as well as how they were mitigating against those, right? The other thing is that right now it's moved from voluntary to present day, right? Where we are still not mandatory, but we are strongly encouraged to adopt corporate reporting tools like GRI, like the Natural Capital Protocol, and frameworks are presently emerging as a result. In the future, it's going to soon become mandatory. And we're seeing this a lot with climate change disclosures and climate change mitigation disclosures. A lot of carbon disclosures are soon becoming mandatory, and it's likely to follow the same path for biodiversity. So I guess in this case, people also want to know, apart from doing this just because there is a national level mandate, why is it that businesses are central to this biodiversity action? Well, I've put 3 points here, and we're just going to touch on each. So the first is data challenges. So especially in this region, in the Caribbean, there's a lot of data challenges in terms of biodiversity collection. We don't have a lot of resources to do a lot of our biodiversity assessments, and so data is often fragmented, incomplete, unavailable. So that means there are emerging business rules in the sense of there are opportunities for data provision as well as partnerships on conservation initiatives. And in these opportunities, there are incentives and drivers. So they may well have preferential procurement from governments as well as institutions, and of course, to align with your national strategies, including the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. So, with any opportunity and responsibility comes challenges. So, engaging in biodiversity actions, you will have things to learn and hurdles to cross. However, if you as businesses move in a strategic way, you will have advantages. Now, some of the challenges include limited local biodiversity data. I mentioned this prior, and this also presents an opportunity to businesses if they do have the resources or if they do have the swing to pivot into this as a business venture. Another challenge is sector-specific biodiversity metrics are unclear. Now, this has more to do with your corporate reporting in that sometimes sector-specific biodiversity metrics are not really present for you to provide a baseline. So you're kind of reporting with no baseline to report against, which is a challenge in of itself. And these are some of the things that we're trying to address when we're trying to improve the monitoring and evaluation for present national biodiversity strategy and action plans to improve baseline data and therefore improve the ability to provide this sort of sector-specific biodiversity metrics for corporate reporting tools. Finally, you have compliance costs. So again, I keep bringing up climate change because it is the present situation that a lot of people are dealing with, and it will become the benchmark upon which we sort of think about how we're going to frame biodiversity management, right? Because after climate change, biodiversity is coming up on us as the next big wave. So compliance costs are rising. There are higher costs for carbon compliance, and there are likely to be higher costs for biodiversity compliance. And in moving early, you gain that strategic and financial advantage, right? So even if you think about being one of the first in the private sector to do these things, you then gain another opportunity to be able to leverage that knowledge, that base, to profit from it by providing that service to other companies, for example, right? And this is where I will move to the opportunities. So you have access to biodiversity finance. There's a lot of green bonds, a lot of credits. I know my colleagues will get into those things a lot more. You also have preferential procurement for biodiversity aligned companies. This is something that may come into the light more. And early compliance, as I said, leads to market leadership and trust. And I also think gives you an edge to pivot into that field if you think about it as a profitable venture. Now, businesses essentially have both a responsibility and an opportunity to drive biodiversity solutions today for a sustainable tomorrow. And the thing is that the global biodiversity framework gives you a shared framework from the global aspect, and our local NBSAPs, our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, provides that local roadmap for businesses in country. And by acting now, your business has an edge, an early start, and can ensure the resilience and success of your company. So it's not really a question of whether you should, it's really how quickly and effectively are you going to step into this role and whether or not you would like to be on the early train to leverage the outcome of that. So I'm not sure I took longer or not, but I am very grateful that you all tuned in, and I hope that this provided some clarity on the global biodiversity framework and how it links to our national frameworks, as well as to your businesses. If nothing else, please remember targets 14, 15, and 19 definitely relate to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deanna. No, you're dead on with time, actually. That's great. So let's move on to our next presenter, Dr. Sinclair. Dr. Sinclair is from Biodiversify. I'm just trying to get my screen up and going here. Yeah, so our next speaker is Dr. Samuel Sinclair, co-founder and director of Biodiversify, conservation consultant dedicated to helping businesses act strategically for nature. So Biodiversify's mission is to educate, empower, and support clients to address biodiversity loss through their operations and supply chain. Drawing on more than a decade of conservation experience across Africa and a PhD from the Imperial College of London focused on social factors that influence biodiversity decisions, Dr. Sinclair has positioned Biodiversify at the forefront of business nature solutions. Under his leadership, Biodiversify has achieved important milestones, such as co-authoring guidance to support private sector biodiversity strategies, supporting the UK government in piloting key aspects of the Environment Act, and forging partnerships with pioneering companies such as Avon, Tetra Pak, and Amazon. So, Dr. Sinclair, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind introduction. What I'm going to do is tell some stories, I think. So I want to talk a little bit about how Biodiversify first started to come to be working with large companies, about their impacts and relationship with nature. And I'll talk through a bit of the kind of journey that companies have gone through over the last few years and give you a bit of an insight into how companies think about this issue, what they're doing, and kind of where they're going, because it's a space that's moving very quickly. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I spent a decade in Africa working all kinds of conservation. My PhD was very much looking at how is it that people make decisions in reality? How is it they actually make choices at large organizations about nature? And off the back of that, I founded Biodiversify, because basically the job I wanted was helping people make better decisions, and that didn't exist, or at least I couldn't find anyone who would hire me to do it. So I founded Biodiversify with Mike Burgess, my co-founder, to basically meet that need. I can see a question where in Africa. Most of the south and the east. I lived in quite a few different countries, doing various different things. That's a whole other story. So one of the first jobs we got was working with Kering, the large fashion company, and they basically said we think we need a biodiversity strategy to match our carbon strategy, but we have no idea how we'd actually do that. We've never heard of anyone doing that before. So we were very honest. So we said, look, well, we also don't know how to do that. We've also never heard of a company doing that before, but we reckon we have the skill sets to work with you. So we started working with Kering, a guide on how to produce corporate biodiversity strategy that came out in 2020. And at that point, that was the only document in the world talking about corporate level biodiversity strategies. That was literally it. So I kind of mark that as the start of the nature positive sector, partly because the term nature positive also got coined by some people in the Natural Capitals Coalition around the same time. And for quite a long time, not a huge amount happened in this space. So we started working with some big tech companies, with Primark, with Tetra Pak, a few others. But for quite a few years, we basically were just working with them to figure out how to do this stuff. There wasn't TNFD or SBTN or any this kind of guidance. So we were just thinking in very practical terms, how should a company think about this? And one of our main sort of insights, really, that partly came from my PhD, is that one of the big challenges with making decisions about nature for a large company is you don't have an overarching metric. Almost everything else, you have an overarching number that you can measure, whether it's watts of electricity or number of people in a room or pounds or pence or dollars or yen or anything. Normally your CEO can stand up and say, well, I would like our number to be higher. I'd like it to be 10% more than it was last year. And people can go away and figure that out. You know, it helps with carbon. You can figure out what your footprint is, which is ultimately a number, and you can say, well, I want that number to be lower and ultimately ideally zero. And here is a time frame over which I'd like you to do that. Which then means you can go through and sort of divvy out responsibility across your company in an appropriate manner. But you can't do that for nature, which means that you've got these large companies struggling with two separate issues. One, how do they get their head around this new topic of biodiversity and nature, making it wisely business relevant? And also, how do they now make decisions and lead and coordinate action in a completely different way to everything they've done before? Because now they're having to do it without a decent way of kind of quantifying it. And because of the complexity of biodiversity, there simply isn't ever going to be an overarching metric for nature. It's just not possible. So a lot of the work we did early on was basically figuring out that actually you had to work with people across a company to figure out what it meant for different parts of the organization. So if we're talking to your procurement team, we might think about, okay, well, where are there areas in your supply chain that might be at risk? Where there is your supply chain that actually might be quite vulnerable due to your dependency on nature? And might there be different kinds of vulnerabilities? Might it be that it might affect quality, or might affect quantity, or might affect price? We might also then work with your marketing and comms team and go, well, who are your key clients or your key customers? What do they think? Your investor relationship team might go, well, we're getting pressure from our investors. Can you give us a way to speak to them effectively? So what we found was, by working with people across the company, you'd start to understand why a company should care about nature, kind of what it means for them, which is normally quite a sort of I normally say you can explain it. I try to always use language you can explain to your mum. It doesn't have to be big and complicated and kind of messy. Normally it's as simple as, well, we're a bit worried that if we don't do something about our supply chain, our core commodity is going to soar in price or become unavailable, or factories might be threatened by floods. And actually we'd like to do something about that to stop it. And what we've seen is that companies are really starting to realize this stuff is really quite important. Over the course of 2023 to 2024, the EU passed the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Basically said that all large companies have to identify and report on their impacts on nature, amongst other things. And that meant that suddenly lots of companies were now having to think about it in a way they hadn't before. So we saw a huge wave of companies basically asking us, can you help us disclose? Can you help us comply? But very much from a kind of regulatory perspective. And then when people started to get a bit more familiar with this topic and they started to realize that actually this is quite relevant, what we've seen is a shift towards companies going, okay, yes, let's align with the frameworks, but can you help me understand why this is business relevant? Can you help me understand how my senior leadership should be thinking about this to change their attitudes, change their strategies, change their policies, change the way that they're perceiving this entire issue? And what we found is when you dig into it, actually much more exposed to biodiversity risks than they realize. The example I'm going to give at this point is cacao. So cacao, obviously the raw ingredient in chocolate is produced in certain parts of the world, but there's only a few places that have the right habitat to grow it. And last year, in 2024, there was a major cacao crisis, and the price of cacao quadrupled in 1 year. Actually went up by 5 times, and if you go over slightly longer than a year period. And what happened was basically in Central Africa, there was massive deforestation, which has left those landscapes very vulnerable to climate change and weather impacts. And then during El Nino last year, there was a quite an unusual event, which I guess is no longer unusual, sadly, due to climate change. And what we saw was highly irregular rainfall. We saw much hotter temperatures, which normally would have been moderated by the forests. But because they cut the forest down, that basically removed all the resilience from the cacao growing regions. This meant that then they very much weakened the cacao trees, so that reduced their yield, but also made the trees vulnerable to an invasive crop disease. Crop disease came in, infected these weakened trees, and basically it doesn't quite kill them, but it basically means you have to cut them down and start again. And it takes quite a long time for a cacao tree to grow and start producing yield again. So that means that it knocked out not only a lot of the yield for last year, but also a lot of the yield for the future. Suddenly, actually, it's going to be quite a long time before cacao productivity goes back up to where it was. And on top of that, it also caused a whole bunch of other environmental issues, from erosion to exacerbating invasive species to other pests, the whole lot, basically. This then meant that people started speculating in a financial way about the future prices of the cacao price skyrocket, as I say, go up 4 times. That then led to social problems. So in Ghana, they have fixed the price as part of their series of complicated things they do about cacao policy. And that has now meant that if you can smuggle cacao across the border, suddenly it's worth a lot more money in a neighboring country. So there are now people smuggling cacao across borders in Central Africa as if it was cocaine. And all of the unpleasant stuff that comes with that is now happening. On top of this, companies that had locked in their supply chain, invested in sustainability, invested in their growers and worked with them, like Lindt, that sell high-end chocolate because it's they need high-quality cacao for the high-quality chocolate they produce, they weren't affected so badly by the prices. So there's lots of headlines talking about them making record profits because suddenly the price of chocolate has gone up. But for them, the cost hasn't gone up because they have these long-term relationships. Whereas companies like Hershey's that make cheaper chocolate and therefore buy on the open market because they normally source the cheapest price, are now massively affected by this because they don't have long-term partners, which means their price of cow has skyrocketed and they pass that price directly on to their consumers. So suddenly, the expensive chocolate now looks quite cheap in comparison to the cheap chocolate that's now gone up dramatically in price. So this is a really good example of how a nature problem takes effect. It's not a slow linear increase that you can watch and measure and manage. It is a sudden shock that comes in very hard and very fast and causes a cascade. So it's not one problem, it's actually 15 separate problems, all cascading to cause a whole socio-ecological crisis that basically highly impacts your supply chain. And once it happens, it's very difficult to reverse. They now have to grow those trees from scratch, which is going to impact yield. That's going to impact productivity for a long time. And for companies that were on the right side of that, who had invest in their supply chain, you can read all about Lind's lovely policies online. They have they've survived that crisis much more effectively than those that didn't, and actually had maybe less responsible attitude. Although Hoshish does still do some work on sustainability. So suddenly, what we see is a sustainability effort has become a direct commercial benefit. So when companies see that, they start to realize, oh, I see. If I don't get on the right side of this, what we will see is other companies using an they turned off for some reason. Right at the end there. And what I was trying to say was, if companies that don't get on the right side of this will see their competitors using their biodiversity sustainability as part of their competitive strategy, and by the time they pick up on that, it will be too late. So what we're seeing now is companies realizing this and starting to figure out what they can do. Can you still hear me? My headphones cut off for a second there. I've gone for about 10 minutes, which I think is correct.
Yeah, Dr. Sinclair, we can hear you. We can hear you. I think we missed the last piece.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Where did you hear me until?
Well, I think it's probably me. Everyone else seems to be fine. So I'll take that then. But
okay, totally good.
I guess you were wrapping up, right?
Yes, I mean basically just highlighting that companies are now seeing they're seeing the cacao example, they're getting more informed about nature, they're understanding it far better, which now means they are seeing it. Yes, there is a compliance and framework alignment perspective that is important, but they're also just realizing this is a commercial consideration. This is no longer about being nice or charity or sustainability, really, in the sort of traditional sense. This is about them figuring out how they can incorporate that as part of their commercial strategy in the same way you might any other issue, which is, to be honest, I think a fantastic thing to see, because it's then it makes it much easier to make the case for doing the right thing, because it's about making money for business at the end of the day, which is the nicest possible way of making sure that action for nature carries on in the long term.
Yeah. All right. But for the interest of time, let's move on to our next presenter.
Thank you.
Who I don't think is a stranger to many of us, Ms. Keisha Garcia. Keisha, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right. So let me introduce Ms. Keisha Garcia. She is the ESG Natural Capital Lead at the Answer Merchant Bank Limited. In this role, she leads and designs the implementation of the bank's ESG strategy across the Answer Merchant banking sector and spearheads the Cari-Bois Natural Capital Program, and also serves as vice chair for the ANCHAM ESG Committee. Ms. Keisha Garcia holds a BSc in zoology with first-class honors and an MPhil in zoology, specializing in environmental toxicology from the University of the West Indies. And if that's not enough, Keisha also has a second MPhil in Environment and Development from the University of Cambridge. Her technical expertise spans from sustainable finance, biodiversity, ecosystem services, climate change, pollution, agriculture, energy, land use, and human rights, with a career in sustainable development that spans over 20 years. She has also contributed to her leadership to several international initiatives, including the UNEP International Resource Panel, the 7th Global Environmental Outlook of UNEP, and the Capitals Coalition Global Advisory Panel, amongst others. So with this, let me hand you over now to Keisha. Keisha, I think you have a presentation. Feel free to share screen.
Thank you so much, Brandon. So let's get that up. Do you see my screen? Let's get into presentation mode. So thank you very much to my colleagues at the Cropper Foundation for organizing this series of webinars that we will now be rolling out under the aegis of the Caribbean Natural Capital Hub. We very much appreciate the partnership. This is the Answer Merchant Bank Group that we have with the Cropper Foundation on this initiative. And their collaboration with us is hugely important. I wish to also thank my fellow speakers, Deanna, who helped to set the stage for some of what I will speak about. And to Sam, thank you very much for giving us some insights into the complexity, but of course the opportunities that sit behind the integration of nature and biodiversity into your business planning. So what I'll be doing today is focusing a little bit on what we've been doing at Answer Merchant Bank to bring biodiversity into our boardroom and into our decision-making frameworks, and then looking at how we're rolling that into our financial planning and the way that we do business. So just very quickly for the audience, a little bit about the Answer Merchant Bank Group. We are part of the Answer Macal group of companies, and the group has set forth a purpose of inspiring better choices for a better world, and that speaks to so many different things. We, as part of this group, just to let you know, we're an indigenous banking group. We are comprised of Answer Merchant Bank Limited here in Trinidad, and we're the parent. We have Answer Merchant Bank Limited in Barbados, a subsidiary, Answer Bank Limited, our commercial and retail arm, and Answer Wealth Management that deals with investment services and wealth management. And across our 4 entities, we offer a full suite of banking and investment services, from retail all the way up to corporate, very big deals. As I said just now, investment services and wealth management as well, mutual funds. We do Forex, a huge suite of services. Now, as part of the Answer Macal group of companies, the banks are committed to long-term sustainability and leadership in the Caribbean space. And here at the banks, we have a very special focus on natural capital. And the speakers before me helped to put that into context. So just a little bit about why we have decided to prioritize natural capital here at our banks. And we are really the only bank in the English-speaking Caribbean that has adopted the natural capital approach. It's partly because the Caribbean is a biodiversity hotspot, meaning very simply, we have a lot of biodiversity, but quite a bit of it is under threat. Nature, as we know, is very vital to our economies and our well-being across our major economic sectors. We have very, very limited resources here in our small islands related to things like land and fresh water, and in other areas as well. And then, of course, the region, we're increasingly seeing these climate-related risks and hazards coming to us. And what this translates to, as my the speakers before me alluded to, are risks to businesses, to financial institutions like us, and at the most fundamental level to our national economies across the region. And we know that our economies are already very fragile. So what we also wanted to do was to look at how we could use the natural capital approach to help address some of these fragilities that we have in the region, such as, you see, food security. where most of us in the region, we're importing the vast majority of our food at huge expense, and of course requiring Forex, US dollars and other types of foreign currency, which has become another very limited resource within the Caribbean region. So what I will do today, we are doing a number of things under the Caribbean Natural Capital Hub with the Cropper Foundation. But what I want to focus on today, and you will have heard Deanna re-emphasize the importance of Target 15 under the Global Biodiversity Framework. I want to show you how we are using Target 15 as a launching pad for much of our decision making here at the bank, and how we're actually actioning biodiversity and nature within our decision making. So a couple of things here to highlight, again, just to re-emphasize, but Deanna did it before me. Target 15 requires businesses to monitor and disclose our impacts and risks as they relate to nature. Also requires us to engage with our consumers, in our case, our customers, and even our suppliers, to promote better practices. But most importantly, and there has been a call more and more at the international level for this, we do not want businesses just stopping at disclosures and putting information out there. The main part, as I've highlighted here, is to use that information to reduce the negative impacts that we're seeing on biodiversity. Not only reduce negative impacts, increase positive impacts. And then, of course, by doing so, reduce the risks that we have to our businesses, especially here in the Caribbean region. So our natural capital reporting process actually began back in 2023, where we started to undertake a materiality assessment to determine, based on our financial portfolios here at the bank, which were the most material impacts that our financing was having on nature. And I'll explain this in a very simplified way. Essentially, the money that we lend, or where we have our investments, we consider that enabling an enabling factor for certain types of activities. So if you fund something that damages nature to some extent as a financial institution, you have a liability for that negative impact. Of course, if there is a positive impact, you have contributed to that positive impact. So what we did was that we undertook a materiality assessment to have a look at where we were having impacts, positive or negative. And we used a series of tools that exist to be able to do that. You will have heard Deanna speak to the Natural Capital Protocol. We used other internationally accepted tools, but here's the trick. The trick is that many of these tools are developed in Europe or other parts of the global north, and in some cases are not 100% applicable to our circumstances here in the Caribbean. So what we had to do is to tweak some of these tools. So we played around with these tools to generate some outputs that would make a little bit more sense to us. And no, it's not junk science. We with the Cropper Foundation, we actually took our time to go through the various aspects of the tools that needed a little bit of tweaking for the type of tropical ecosystems we have, the size of those ecosystems, etc. And so based on that, we came up with a materiality type of analysis, which allowed us to know the types of sectors within our financial portfolios that were most at risk and that were having the greatest impact on nature. Following that process, with that understanding in our back pocket, last year, we partnered with an international company valuing impact. I just want to tell you a little bit about how this came to be. So the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, they realized that we were trying to do some work around natural capital. And at the time when they first engaged with us, most of their financing was in favor of climate mitigation. But when they came to us and they saw the work that we were doing, they said, okay, we will take this grant and we will extend the scope of the grant to cover the type of work that you would like to accomplish, because this is first mover in the market. And we want to see how we can actually use this to help other businesses around the region as well. So with some funding, non-reimbursable funding from the IDB, we were able to engage some technical consultants who, through the use of a series of tools here, have actually helped us to do some quantification. Now, you're going to be the first crowd to get some quick insights into what we will soon be publishing as the results of our baseline quantification. That report is going to be out in about a month's time. And here we are for the first time showing that to a live audience. So here's what the quantified data tells us. And what I want you to understand is that in terms of our disclosures at this stage, we have a lot more data in what we call the back office. So a lot of financial numbers, crunching, looking at impacts, positive, negative. We have a lot of that we are using internally. We are not yet disclosing all of it because we realize that we still need to do a little refining in terms of our methodology. But essentially what we have found is that some of our sectors within our financial portfolios, this would be both lending and investments. And this shows here just for the Trinidad and Tobago based banks. What we found is that sectors such as services, energy and mining, manufacturing, construction, agriculture are the ones that come out to be the most impactful. And these are negative impacts mostly, are the most impactful on our local biodiversity and ecosystem services. We went even deeper and we looked at the types of impacts. We call these impact drivers, the types of impacts that we were having, or not having, but through our financing, the types of impacts that we would be quote unquote enabling, I suppose, through financing different activities across our sectors. What this diagram shows quite interestingly is that, yes, climate change is, in fact, the biggest impact that we are having across the entire portfolio. However, what this revealed is that for two of the most important sectors in the Caribbean, which are agriculture and hospitality, you will notice that climate change is not, in fact, the biggest impact. Land use and our impacts on land use are, in fact, the most concerning. And this is hugely important. These types of insights are hugely important when you come now to your financial decision making, because it then enables you to understand that in addressing some of the sectors that you have in your portfolio, you may wish to put in place certain types of products or services that help to address land use in agriculture and hospitality, say, for example, as opposed to just purely climate mitigation. We also had a quick look at our risks, and quite unsurprisingly, the biggest risk that we saw, this is the biggest nature-related risk, comes from flooding. We dug even deeper using ODPM data, and we're very grateful to the ODPM for making their data available to us. When we superimposed our mortgage portfolio onto an ODPM map, and my colleague, one of my colleagues who's excellent at this type of work, helped us with this through a consultancy. What we found is that quite a large chunk of our portfolio is in the highest level of risk, compromising just about 1/3 of the financial investments that we have in that portfolio. So we do, in fact, need to look at how we manage flooding within our financing. So that's just a little bit of insights into our data and the work that we are doing to prepare ourselves for disclosure. But I want to talk a little bit now about how we're using the data. And I want to remind you that this is where the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is pushing us to look at how we actually move now to reducing those negative impacts and then concurrently improving the way that we engage with nature. So here's a little bit of a roadmap as to what we're doing. So the baseline quantification is there. The next step, as you will have heard one of the previous speakers mention, is that we're moving towards the establishment of some science-based targets to guide our action. Where do we want to get to in terms of reducing those negative impacts and improving the positive impacts? And I would say one thing that's really worked in our favor in terms of looking at these science-based targets is that we were actually selected, the only entity in the Caribbean to be selected, a group of 7 from around the world, to be fair, to be part of an international integrity council for the validation of science-based targets for nature. And that is really helping us internally to look at where we place our targets. The next step is looking at a strategy. So we need to develop a strategy. We know where we want to go. The strategy is how we plan to get there. And we will be working with our head office in shaping some of this strategy towards meeting the targets that we set. Another important thing that we have not lost sight of, and Deanna spoke very much to data and having good data, is that we do need a proper system for collecting and monitoring the data that we are getting from our customers and other places, and then using that in both our reporting and decision making. The next thing that we're doing is we are fashioning some sustainable finance solutions to go to customers with, and these are loans that we are now trying to fashion that would engage customers and help to incentivize good practices. And there are 3 priority sectors. We can't address everything all at once. We are trying to be pragmatic. There are 3 priority sectors for these sustainable finance solutions that we're currently targeting: sustainable agriculture and food security, sustainable energy and energy security, and then sustainable waste management. And these loans are not just to be applied here in Trinidad and Tobago, but we also plan to be using these wherever we finance across the Caribbean. And then finally, we want to ensure that we collect data, monitor so that we collect data and that we report in line with international best practice. And just to give you a quick sense, again, speakers before me spoke to some of this. What we are doing is that we are aligning our nature-related reporting with the recommendations of the TNFD, or the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We're also looking at moving towards IFRS S1 compliance, and this is in collaboration with our head office. This is something that is happening across the entire group of companies at ANSA-McAL. And so we are using SASB and GRI metrics, but very importantly here, we're imposing a double materiality approach, which doesn't only look, that means that we're not only looking internally at the risks to our business, but we are paying very special attention as well to the impacts that we have with the environment and with society. And then we are keeping our fingers and toes crossed because we are also part of some international groups that are working towards and lobbying very hard for another standard to be added to the IFRS. So, you know, there's a sustainability standard S1, the climate standard S2, and now they are working towards a nature standard, which is likely to be S3. And we're keeping our fingers and toes crossed that this comes on stream very soon. Quickly, some of the things we've learned, some of the enabling factors for successful integration of nature-related considerations into decision-making. And Sam has just before me outlined that this is a difficult thing. It's not easy, it's not straightforward. But some of the things that have allowed us to progress in this space are the very strong buying and support that we get from our board and our managing director. And even when we've had a change of leadership, we've had succession in terms of that strong buy-in. We also have very good internal collaboration across all of our business units. So my bankers are always, working with me on different aspects. Operations always there with me at looking at the internal systems. You do need very robust technical skills, and Cropper Foundation and I can't do all of it. So we do, in fact, draw on international expertise to get some of this done. Deanna spoke to needing reliable data. And you know what? This is where we have decided if it isn't available, we're going to help create it. So we've actually launched a technical working group with the Cropper Foundation to develop a research agenda for biodiversity in business here in Trinidad and Tobago. And that is meant to look at where the gaps are in terms of our data needs for both reporting and action. And once that agenda is established, we'll be using that to advocate for businesses to help fill gaps in different aspects required for us to do what is necessary based on the global biodiversity framework and other reporting requirements. And then I cannot underpin ever so much the importance of strong partnerships with everybody, your investors and donors, and we've had several of them now trying to engage with us on this, civic society, the Cropper Foundation, among others, government to get that political buy-in, academia for the data and information, and of course our customers and suppliers and our shareholders. So I thank you very much. A lot happening. We can't cover everything here. A little bit of a teaser there on what our next natural capital report in a couple of weeks will look like. So please keep tuned, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Really great stuff, Keisha. I see Ryan as well in the chat has echoed and commend the bank for some of the work that they're doing and how they're aligning their portfolio with some of these risks as well. So we have a few questions in the chat, and I'm looking at the time as well. But this one is from Shandell. I think it's directed to Dr. Sinclair. She's asking about what area in Africa have you been working in? But more so, this is specifically directed to Dr. Sinclair. What concerns arise when biodiversity is assessed primarily through external lens, and in this case we're calling it parachute science, where research is conducted in regions like Africa or the Caribbean, but the knowledge and benefits often flow back to foreign institutions rather than local communities, and may even cause greenwashing.
Yeah, so this is a pretty important topic, actually. I think there's two aspects to this, right? There's the research itself, which I'm not hugely qualified to talk about, as the research, well, the work I was doing was largely like direct action. PhD I did was in partnership with South African University and a South African government themselves, and I fed it back to them and shared it with them in that way, so that it was useful for them. But I think within this broader nature positive sector, I think it's quite important that we are conscious of the power dynamics. If we have, all right, Amazon's our client, if they're sourcing something from Central Africa, the disparity in power, the power imbalance between Amazon and local communities in, say, Ghana, are about as extreme as it's possible to get. I struggle to think of a more extreme power imbalance. So I think it's a really important principle that we make sure these things are done in a collaborative way, that it's not something that companies come in and start doing to organizations and communities around the world, and as you say, risk echoing previous imperialist paradigms that I think are not appropriate in this, well, any time, but particularly this day and age. So I would say part of the core here is making sure that it's not necessarily the companies themselves directly taking action, but rather they are working within institutions who have, ideally local institutions, who have the appropriate skills and knowledge and systems in place to make sure that it's fair and equitable and that the benefits are shared in a fair and equitable way. I think at the core of this, really, it's about making sure that local institutions play an important role in these projects, and it's not just, to put it a little bit crudely, banks in the UK or Europe or America funding NGOs in Europe or America to do action, be consultants in Europe or America. I think that is not really the action that we need out of this. I think it needs to be much more equitable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of touched on something that Keisha mentioned there in terms of many of the tools that even use for the metrics and measuring biodiversity impacts and with businesses developed in mind with the global north. And of course, that being said, it's a bit difficult to adapt to our local socioeconomic and biophysical realities. So this is, I guess, now spinning to the wider panel. What advice would you give, especially to smaller businesses, on how we can navigate through these challenges? We are already faced with the lax data in the Caribbean, as well as now also, I don't want to say unsuitable metrics or calculators, but some that are not necessarily developed with the Caribbean in mind. I think, Keisha, you mentioned, of course, the work that we're doing right now with the Knowledge Working Group, with creating that knowledge bank. But are there any other ways that small businesses can actually adopt or navigate through the challenges of lack of data?
So thank you so much for that question, Brandon. It's an ongoing conversation about how we ensure that small, medium-sized businesses are not left behind in the conversation, in the benefits and everything. I think one of the major things that we are doing here at the banks, and certainly in collaboration with the Cropper Foundation, because this is where we leverage our collective skills, looking at how we could do some capacity building for small and medium enterprises. What we have found is that SMEs are actually very proactive. So back in 2023, under the Caribbean Natural Capital Hub, we had launched the Natural Capital Grant Challenge for small and medium-sized enterprises to see what they were doing, what was happening in the market. And we were flabbergasted, I think is the word, when we received 54 applications that we had huge difficulty trying to shortlist, to select 3 winners. What that taught us at the banks was a lot of humility and the fact that we can actually learn from SMEs. So it's not only about them learning from us or learning from, bigger companies. The truth is that, with the Cropper Foundation, and I want to always ensure that I highlight this partnership with the Cropper Foundation because it has been invaluable, is that with SMEs and the capacity building, it's a core learning process. We need to understand what they are doing, and we need to work with SMEs to see how we can fashion some of the needs, whether it be data collection or reporting, to fit their needs. So that's an ongoing process, and capacity building for those SMEs on the call. We do have in our 2026 strategic plan to roll out some training specifically for SMEs, but we won't be doing that without first consulting with SMEs to see what they need, so that we can actually start to address the gaps. And I hope that answers at least some of the question.
Absolutely, absolutely. And well, this one actually is towards Deanna, but of course the wider panel could weigh in as well. Dachel, I hope I didn't butcher your name, had asked, basically, the idea of adopting biodiversity insights into your businesses is sort of a cultural issue as well. There's a cultural facet there. Locally, of course, we have some problems, like, for example, not recycling. We don't have the infrastructure in place for these type of things. So I think Dachel is asking, hey, what are some of the avenues through legislation or policy that we can actually put forward in onboarding some of these sustainable practices, if I can call it that?
Yeah, so thanks, Dachel. I hope neither Brandon nor I butchered your name. So interesting question, and I think the NBSAP is really the pinnacle or the foundation on how we address that, right, on national levels. So when we first started doing NBSAPs, and this would be like in the 1990s, each one progressively it improves, it gets better, and just like anything in life, when we now start to address the problem, over time we learn, right? And over time we understand how to better improve it and fix the issues that are ongoing. That's why we as a globe could successfully fix the ozone layer, for example, right? So with that context in mind, the NBSAPs are really the national level plan and priorities of how we are going to address this, both nationally on a government level and importantly for these attendees on a business level. So when I mentioned in my talk that the global biodiversity framework for the first time explicitly mentions businesses as pinnacle in biodiversity conservation, that is a huge win, right? That's a huge win on a global level. I can't overstate that enough, because that means that just like businesses are being held to a higher standard for their carbon disclosure, for their impacts on a climate change aspect, they're now being held and will continue to be held to a stricter and stricter standard for their biodiversity impacts, right? Because the two are now also linked. The Convention on Biological Diversity and the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Treaty, basically, they now also link together. They say that biodiversity is impacted by climate change, and climate change resilience is impacted by biodiversity health. Those two things also happened on sort of tandem, and it's very groundbreaking, right? It sounds like very obvious to people in this room who are in the biodiversity, the climate change, the environmental and sustainability sector, because we know this. But to have 100 and something countries agree to say, yes, this is a fact, is groundbreaking. And because of that, the NBSAPs now include this information, and that is a national policy that informs our rules, our legislation, our laws. It also will inform businesses and how businesses' regulations are going to be framed, how the policies are going to be framed, and therefore how their businesses are going to run. Now, I know I probably answered a very long-winded way to say that, but the summary is basically that by framing these NBSAPs and integrating targets 14, 15, and 19, which are the targets that relate to businesses, into these NBSAPs, it's going to tie private sector, tie businesses to biodiversity impacts, and the regulations and the rules that they have to abide by are also going to be part and parcel of that, right? Now, I know that it needs to happen faster, just like climate change needs to happen faster. But it's happening, right? And I think we always need to try to, as far as possible, think about the benefits. Belize did an excellent job with updating and revising its NBSAP. And the important thing is that we were able to do a solid M&E. A big weakness in previous NBSAPs is that it was hard to monitor, track it, and report on how the NBSAPs would do it. In Belize, we made a sound M&E, and for Trinidad and Tobago, it is our intention and our plan to also make a very strong M&E plan to go with the NBSAP so that there is good reporting, good monitoring, good evaluation, right? Because without those things, you're not going to get the baselines you need. Reporting without knowing where you're standing is, it's kind of pointless. So I hope that provide some context and also provide a little bit of optimism to the game.
Absolutely. Great work. I think that speaks to the ethos of your entire presentation, to be honest, Deanna. And I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it also linked to something that Dr. Sinclair said. And I mean, that's my take home from this as well. That our relationship with nature isn't linear. So we can't expect, like our actions or our reporting and stuff like that to also be, going on that linear path. Now, folks, we could talk clearly about this all afternoon, and I'm actually so happy to see everyone is still on the call, even though we are long past closure time. But that being said, let me thank all of our speakers for their insights and everyone who joined us today for a rich discussion. This is just the start of the webinar series, so this was our first one, and we're excited to continue exploring how Caribbean private sector can lead on nature positive actions. Our next session, will be coming up in October, so stay tuned for details on the save the date, and we will actually share more of that of the card with you, the webinar card with you. And until then, I just want to say thanks again for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.